The idea of earning money from carbon captured in soil is an enticing one for many farmers, but it can be expensive joining the carbon credit market. Scientists are working on an alternative to expensive soil testing, a simulator which can be applied across all types of farming. Here's Landline's Courtney Wilson.
On a grey spring afternoon, not too far from Gundawindi, the harvesters are going flat strap. Brothers Luke and Callum McDonald are about a quarter of the way through the wheat harvest. They're trying to beat some incoming wet weather to get as much of the crop off as possible before these paddocks become too wet. That's been a familiar story this season.
It has been very wet spring, yeah. Just when you think you're going to get going with the header, yeah, it seems weekly you get about an inch of rain.
This property is called Goondooi. It covers 2,800 hectares and is one of 5 farms which make up the McDonald family's mixed farming operation on Queensland's Darling Downs.
We're about 60 kilometres northeast of Gundawindi. We grow chickpeas, wheat, barley, sorghum, different legumes, lab, cowpeas, and we have livestock as well in rotational grazing.
The McDonalds have been farming here for more than 40 years. Over that time, they've slowly grown their operations. Today, their farms cover more than 11,000 hectares. More recently, alongside the crops and cattle, they've also opened up their land to scientists.
We're using what we call eddy covariance flux towers. What flux towers do is actually integrate information, integrate over the landscape carbon flows. Plants are taking up CO2 during the day, soils and plants are emitting CO2 during the night. By putting all that information together using simulation models, we can actually then tell you how your practices will change soil carbon.
Striving to understand and improve soil health is not new, nor is a spotlight on carbon.
Because you're looking at small, very minute changes in carbon dioxide.
For years, farmers have been hearing about the carbon credit market and the idea of using carbon credits to offset emissions. For those with more land than the average city dweller, it seems like a no-brainer, the chance to make money on the carbon being captured on their properties. But it's not quite that simple. One of the big barriers for measuring soil carbon is cost. Traditionally, it's involved physically drilling down into the earth and then taking that core sample back to a lab for testing. And in Australia, that can be an expensive exercise.
Obviously depends on the number of samples, obviously depends on location, variability, and I'm hearing numbers like $100,000 for the initial soil sampling before you actually start your project.
For many smaller farmers, that kind of hefty upfront expenditure simply rules them out immediately.
If you're going to spend a lot of money measuring soil carbon, you've actually got to be quite confident that you're going to earn a decent amount of carbon credits so that the return or the revenue or whatever benefit you get from measuring those carbon credits is more than the cost of measuring them to begin with.
So the search is on for a better, more accurate and more economic way to measure soil carbon. This flux tower is part of a network that has been installed on rural properties throughout Queensland and New South Wales as part of a large-scale research trial led by Queensland University of Technology.
A flux tower is a suite of instruments that basically capture photosynthesis. But not only how much carbon's going in through photosynthesis, but how much also comes back out through plant respiration and soil respiration. So what it really gives us is a balance of the carbon entering and exiting our soils.
The research that's coming out is truly groundbreaking in terms of having lots of these flux towers measuring what's happening in terms of carbon drawdown into the plants and the soil 20 times a second, 24/7, 365 days a year.
On this property, 3 flux towers have been installed in different paddocks to gauge the effects of pasture versus cropping on the flow of carbon. As well as carbon, scientists are also measuring other trace gases.
So we need to make sure that if we're using legumes to sequester carbon, that we're not pollution swapping, that we might be getting carbon going into our soils, for the extra grass and whatnot we grow, but if we're producing more nitrous oxide, it might actually be offsetting some of that. So this is really just how we confirm that that's not actually the case. Down here, we're just not quite hitting that maximum biomass.
The whole idea of this work is to build a digital twin of a farm to be used as a toolkit to effectively model and understand in a computer system all of the major variables that will impact on the productivity of that farm.
Together with the flux towers, with the chambers, with our phenocams and our technology suite here, we can basically give almost a real-time carbon budget of this pasture, and particularly of this management. So we can say this management's sequestering carbon and this one's not.
That information can then be used by the landholder as a guide for managing the farm.
They can make the right decisions and simulate those decisions before actually investing what is often a very large sum of money in effecting a treatment change on their property.
So, Luke, as a farmer, is there a benefit for you actually knowing what's in your soil?
Yeah, there's a huge benefit knowing what's in your soil. I think it's critical that every farmer should know what's happening in their soil. A healthy soil is a healthy plant. Healthy plants are healthy animals and healthy environment.
So if we can see this grazing event comes in and they didn't graze it as effectively as they could have, we actually see that translated in the data. We can see that in almost real time. And so that's a really valuable tool for also managing pastures, not just on the carbon side of things, but also on the production side of things.
So what does that mean for the future? Will farmers actually be able to cash in on carbon credits? The science says yes, but with some caveats.
There is potential for some landholders to have a viable income stream. And you must remember, soil carbon does have its issues in terms of permanence. If you can increase carbon, you've signed a contract with the government or the aggregator, whatever, who's paying you to make sure that carbon level is maintained into the future, 25 years, 50 years, 100 years. That's a contract. So can you do that?
Aside from actually being paid money for carbon credits, there is an argument that working to improve your soils and keeping a check on your carbon flow will pay off anyway, in the long run.
If you can keep your emissions down and your product is a low carbon product, that's saleable.
We're starting to hear more and more that at some point in the future, the carbon footprint or carbon intensity of products is going to start to feature in buyers' decision-making process.
Beyond consumer choices, if the Australian government is to achieve its commitment to reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 43% below 2005 levels by the year 2030, it's clear agriculture will need to play a significant part.
Agriculture emits 15% of Australian emissions, so it does provide a pathway if you can break down your emissions from that route. Definitely farmers, landholders can play a big part.
To do so, though, farmers need to have a detailed understanding of their land and how its management impacts emissions.
The number one way to do it is do an account on your farm. See where your emissions are coming from, and you then know where you stand. And then you can start thinking where you can make reductions without affecting your productivity.
Unfortunately, not every farmer has access to a flux tower, and that isn't really achievable. But using the flux tower research, scientists are developing a toolkit to enable landholders to simulate soil carbon and productivity changes under different management practices, based on extensive scientifically backed data.
It is much cheaper to do this integrated measurement. We're comparing it with soil sampling, and there are some definite management practices that you can bring into grazing systems that will give you a small change in carbon but over a large area, and that adds up.
We're looking at small sequestration rates over bigger periods of time. The analogy we use for that is it's equivalent of measuring a change of a teaspoonful of water in a swimming pool.
On the McDonald's place, they've recently trialled different deep-rooted legumes, and like most farmers, Luke is always looking for productivity gains.
I'd like to know every kilo of beef that I put on my animals, how much carbon that we're putting back in the soil for every kilo that we're putting on. That's the figure I'd like to know.
Dave Rawlings says getting that kind of minute breakdown is actually possible. The more data that's collected, the closer they are to achieving that kind of insight.
We want to produce something that's useful for farmers to use, is economical for farmers to use, and ultimately demonstrate either that they're doing good practice in sequestering carbon or at least maintaining their carbon, plus hopefully measuring their productivity gains as well.
Farming over 11,000 hectares is big picture stuff, but to do it well, you have to pay attention to the small details, even those you can't see.
Carbon dioxide doesn't stop at a farm boundary, so they're doing a job to pull down carbon from the atmosphere for greater humanity, and it's only fair that they receive a benefit for doing that.
I'd like to think that it captures the true fundamentals of farming in a way, like as in we're trying to help build our soil and maybe get paid for it at the same time.